Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
A friend of mine actually made the news, economist Bryan Caplan at George Mason University.
Wait a second, you have friends?
I have a couple. Actually, I haven't talked to him. Friend is probably a stronger term than I should be using. He's someone I've spoken to on a number of occasions.
So you have me and Bryan Caplan.
Yeah, although I talked to you more. What's happened here is his university, George Mason, has instituted, as universities do, a requirement that students have to take this new type of course. It's not a course unto itself. Rather, they give this designation to courses that qualify. And this designation is a Just Societies designation.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, it comes from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which a lot of businesses have, and universities, of course, have this. Bryan makes the news because he tweeted, and I'll just read from the tweet. George Mason is a public university funded by Virginians with a wide range of political views about the nature of justice. The Just Societies Initiative is a thinly veiled effort to teach far-left views of justice as the one true position. Even people who agree with such views should ponder the justice of creating an official, state-sanctioned orthodoxy and requiring all students to spend multiple classes feigning agreement with it. Now, what is funny about this is that someone reported him to the, Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
That seems right. And what did the kangaroo court there decide?
I don't know what happened beyond this, so I don't know what the DEI office decided. However, I did look into this Just Societies designation, and to give a little bit of, what is a term that you use? It's a sports term. Inside what? Inside baseball. To give a little inside baseball to what's going on here. Universities often, when they want students to take some particular, I shouldn't say subject, but they want students to take a particular slant. For example, international slant on learning. What happens is courses that faculty are teaching in all sorts of other disciplines, they will apply and they'll say, put their hand up and say, look, my course satisfies your learning outcomes for international studies. Therefore, give it a blessing. Let it count as an international studies course. And then when a student takes that course, let's say it's a philosophy course, the student satisfies a philosophy requirement and satisfies this international studies requirement. So it's this blessing that's put upon courses. And so too here, George Mason has established a blessing for Just Societies courses. Now, here's where life gets interesting. I have here George Mason's website where they list the learning outcomes. What does it take to be blessed as a Just Societies course? And I read you, courses with a Just Societies flag or designation must meet both of the following outcomes. 1. Define key terms related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as related to this course's field, and use those terms to engage meaningfully with peers about course issues. So that's item number 1. Item number 2. The course must articulate obstacles to justice and equity and strategies for addressing them. Now, stop and think about this for a moment. The committee that gives its blessing for this Just Societies designation is typically, I don't know what happens at George Mason, but at all universities I've been associated with, the blessing is given by a committee of basically volunteers. You volunteer to sit on this committee and you give its blessing. Now, who's going to want to sit on a committee like this? Generally speaking, people who are interested in pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this item number 1, learning outcomes, to get the blessing, you must define key terms related to justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. In other words, the people who are going to bless your course with this designation are people who already have in their minds what those terms mean.
They don't have in their minds, they know for certain.
it is likely not the case that a course with this blessing is going to be asking the question, what do these terms mean? Rather, it will be telling the students these are what the terms mean.
And more than that, it's going to tell the students, and this is how we apply this.
Yes, and that brings us to item number 2 in the learning outcomes: articulate obstacles to justice and equity and strategies for addressing them. Why would you restrict this to articulating obstacles to justice and equity? Why not also articulate encouragements to justice and equity? Why talk about strategies for addressing these things rather than, or in addition to, impediments for addressing these things?
The greatest book ever written about justice is Plato's Republic, and you likely couldn't teach it as a just society text because it doesn't concern itself with equity and inclusion.
Yeah, I would imagine so. It looks, and again, I'm looking at their website, but this is all I'm seeing. It looks like these courses that Brian Kaplan has an argument here, that these courses seem to be designed to push this particular view of justice, equity, diversity, rather than ask the question, which is what we should be doing in a university setting: what are these things? What do they mean? And what helps bring these things about? And what are impediments to bringing these things about?
Brian might be able to shock the taxpayers of Virginia, but he's not going to shock anybody who ever worked as a professor.
Oh, no. This is another day at a university here.
This is how the entire field of English has been captured by crackpots. Karl Marx isn't read in economics departments, he's read in English departments.
That's right, yeah.
Which is a little strange given that he didn't write in English.
He didn't write about economics either.
I guess we're just here to point out the bleeding obvious.
But this is an example of something I've talked about in the past, that there are courses in a university, there are many courses in universities that have no market demand. And you know they have no market demand because of things like this, that the university requires the students to take it. No one requires the students to take finance. There's plenty market demand for this.
They want to learn things that will help them with that.
But, universities typically, in my experience, are about 20 years behind what's going on in the rest of the world. And at the same time that universities are pushing these DEI courses, diversity, equity, inclusion, what's happening in the business world? Businesses are getting rid of the DEI offices.
Trust me, though, this nonsense isn't over by a long shot. I'm going to go from idiotic, depressing thing to the breathless headline from CNBC. 47% of parents still financially support adult children.
47%.
To bottom line it for you, on average, parents are spending about $1,384 a month on their adult children.
Good Lord.
Yeah, a little more than I expected. When I saw the headline, my immediate reaction was, what's this going to say? Well, when the child's refrigerator broke, we gave him $500 to help him out with it. Does that count?
Right.
Because that's the kind of thing parents just do and never really think twice about. My daughter moves out. I say, oh, well, you don't have a couch. Here, did I support her financially? I guess, but I didn't really think about it in those terms. When you dig into the report, you find that, no, they're not really talking about that. What they're really talking about are things like paying the rent, paying the cell phone bill.
Okay, so I was going to say, are they imputing rent? In other words, if the kid comes and back home and lives at home, it's not costing the parent anything, but somewhere you could say, well, that's the equivalent of $500 a month.
To that question, I don't know what the answer is. It is the case that more of these adult children than you might think are living at home. I don't know when you crawl into how the data was parsed, what counts exactly.
Right.
I had the exact same question about rent.
Paying for an adult child's rent who isn't living at home, that's ridiculous. I mean, you're just creating a ward of the state, or first a ward of the household, and then eventually a ward of the state.
It does become interesting to think about what adulthood has come to mean. You can get an interior view of what we're talking about when you get some of the text, from buying food to paying for a cell phone plan or covering health and auto insurance. Nearly half, or 47% of parents with a child older than 18, provide them with at least some financial support. And the report is by savings.com. It's linked in the story. You could go dig around in there if you'd like.
On the other hand, Look at how wealthy we are, that we can afford to support our adult children.
You're going to have to sooner or later conclude that adulthood starts much later than 18.
You know, some time ago, maybe 2, maybe 3 years ago, we did an episode in which we posited that you should be allowed to just decide for yourself. One-shot deal, okay, henceforth, from this point forward, I'm an adult, and certain things happen. Or not. Let individuals choose. Why draw a line in the sand and apply it to everybody?
I still stand by that thought that we had back then. We took a lot of heat for it. People didn't care for it. But I think it was one of the better ideas that we've had over the years. We both have older adult children at this point. I don't know when I'm no longer responsible for providing health care for them. Mm-hmm. I honestly don't know. They just keep jacking that age up. I think it's like 24 or 26, something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
And when you think about how this group of adult children is the most well-educated generation we've ever had, we're not preparing them for work. The education is not preparation for a career. That, of course, Ant, brings us to the foolishness of the week. Tucker Carlson. I don't even know what to call him. Journalist, talking head? I mean, he has a head and he talks, but it seems to be an insult to talking heads. Nonetheless, he is already, now this is March of 2024, 8 months away from the election. And what's he starting with already? Joe Biden can't win in a fair election, he said. He's setting us up for stolen election nonsense already.
He might as well jump on that bandwagon, because it's coming.
I guess Joe Biden did win a fair election. You may not like it, but that's what happened. And all of our elections, generally speaking, are pretty fair. But people actually care about that here. If you think there are wholesale problems with the elections, why is it the case that almost no one is ever prosecuted? And yet, this is the argument, and now we have Tucker Carlson setting the stage for the next one. Do I have any interior knowledge that would lead me to say Trump or Biden is likely to win the next election? No, not really. I think all the reasons that Biden won last time are probably still there, and yet when you look at the electoral map, it's not in March adding up to a win for Biden. It's adding up to an overwhelming win for Trump. But we've got 8 months between now and then.
Yeah, things change a lot in these last months.
And frankly, when you have two candidates aged 81 and 77, and they're both showing significant signs of decline, we're in new uncharted territory. We haven't had candidates this old.
One thing would surprise me. Whichever one wins, the other people say, okay, he won. That would surprise me.
That would surprise me as well. But in 1980, people thought the world was coming to an end because a 69-year-old man was running for president.
That's right. Ronald Reagan, yeah.
69, it seems almost cute in retrospect.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. Spike Cohen, former Libertarian Vice-Presidential nominee, joins us this week for the first of a 2-part episode.
We're here with Spike Cohen, Vice Presidential candidate on the Libertarian ticket some years ago.
Well, last time through, right?
Yeah, the last election, yeah.
Welcome to Words and Numbers. It's been a long time coming.
It has been a very long time coming. And by that, I mean, I have basically pressured both of you to have me on the show. I comment on your videos and I say, please have me on the show. And I see you at events and I'm like, please. So I appreciate that you have finally agreed to allow me to be on the show. So it means a lot to me.
That's no reflection of our attitude toward you, but simply the fact that we're disorganized.
That's fair.
It's not that. It's that we ran out of other guests.
No, well, that's part of the disorganization. It's like, oh, crap, we don't have a guest.
Here we are.
That guy keeps begging. This is 2 birds with 1 stone. We have a guest and he'll leave us alone.
In the interest of full and honest disclosure, Spike does not beg to come on this show.
Yeah.
Has never begged to come on this show. But I appreciate the fact that you tried to lie to the nice people out there to make us look really good. Thanks. So, Spike, we wanted to start by talking about your ill-fated, star-crossed run for the vice presidency. I've thought for a while, and I'm sure you have too, and I know Ant has too, that libertarians consistently win in the battle of ideas.
Yes.
Right? We do pretty well in the battle of ideas, and yet that never, and I mean never, in the United States anyway, we'll get to Argentina one of these days, but in the United States, that does not translate to electoral victories at all. So what the hell is the disconnect? Why are libertarian ideas so palatable, but libertarians are not?
There's two parts to this. The first, and I think the easiest one to address, our ballot access system is set up in such a way that if you are not running as a Republican or a Democrat, you are almost ensured that you can't win. If you decide to run as anything other than a Republican or a Democrat, you have to have tens of millions of dollars, or at least several $1 million, and you have to have tens to hundreds of thousands of activists across the country, dozens of specialized attorneys in order to fight to even have your name on the ballot across the country. And even then, there's a good chance that at least one or two states will still be successful in keeping you off the ballot because they've set it up that way. It's funny because two of the biggest remaining vestiges of the Jim Crow era are gun control and ballot access restrictions. The difference is that, especially with ballot access restrictions, it's now nationwide. There are only maybe a dozen or so states where pretty much all you have to do is, pay whatever the fee is to be on the ballot and certify that you are who you say you are and that kind of stuff and to be on the ballot. Most other states, you have to get tens, hundreds of thousands of signatures just to be on the ballot. I'll give you one example of that. In Tennessee, if you run as a Republican or Democrat for any office, you have to get 25 signatures. And I get that. It's like, otherwise you could just have this spam thing where 1,000 people are running for, governor or whatever, and the ballot becomes this unwieldy mess. And so they're like, listen, if you get 25 signatures, verified signatures from people that aren't you, then you can be on the ballot. It shows that you've actually done something. Fair enough. If you want to run as anything other than a Republican or a Democrat, you have to get 50,000 signatures. You have to get 2,000 times as many signatures. And because all of the people in these offices that verified the ballot access signatures, the petition signatures, are all appointed by Republicans or Democrats, you really have to get more like 100,000 signatures.
Wow.
If you run for a city council race and you don't want to run as a Republican or Democrat, and your constituency is significantly less than 100,000, you still have to get 100,000 signatures. It is insanity. That's one of the more egregious examples. The bottom line is that's what we're up against in multiple states, and especially the bigger ones. New York, Illinois, California, they're among the worst. And what that does is that feeds into a phenomenon that already exists, which is, and I need to remember to look up how this is pronounced, but I think it's Davies' law or Diverger's law, which basically says in any first past the post system, in any system where whoever gets the most votes wins and there's no plural voting or whatever, people tend to fall into a binary of either this side or this side because of the whole idea of the so-called lesser evil and, so-called strategic voting and all of that. So on top of that issue, you then have just the difficulty of getting on the ballot and the fact that while Republicans and Democrats are literally getting hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer funding for their campaigns, their conventions, their primaries, and everything else, we're having to spend millions of dollars just to get on the ballot. And so there's just this massive uphill battle right off the bat. That addresses that for the most part. And it kind of reinforces the narrative people have, which is, well, I'm not going to vote for you because you can't win. Well, yeah, if you don't vote for me, I can't win as well. That goes both ways. So that kind of addresses that. But I think when it comes to why the belief in libertarian policies doesn't always turn into them agreeing with us come election day, or the policy come election day, is that the status quo, the people running the show, have done a really good job of playing this endless good cop, bad cop routine with people. It's how they're able to get people to vote for the so-called lesser evil, but it's also how they're able to get you to kind of hate your neighbor and be okay with authoritarianism if you believe that they're going to be the primary recipient of the harm. Like, yeah, there might be some that comes back on you, but as long as they're mostly suffering and more than me, then I won. That's a big problem that we face. And whether we're talking about new regulations, new taxes, especially when we're talking about issues with education and things like that. More and more, it's about, okay, as long as this hurts their side more, or I think they're the primary target of it, then I'm good with it. And of course, so they always make sure you think that. So that's another big problem that we face. You mentioned briefly Argentina. It took Argentina falling apart for them to finally go, okay, enough of this scam. Who's the guy that's going to rip this thing to shreds? And Javier Milei said, I've been saying that from day one. I hope it doesn't take us reaching a point of triple-digit inflation coupled with a brutal multi-year depression. It did for Argentina.
I want to follow up on something here. A couple of episodes ago, we were talking about the imminent bankruptcy of the Republican Party as Donald Trump pulls money out. So walk me through this, because this is all news to me, this ballot access and hundreds of thousands of signature business.
Oh, yeah.
What happens if the Republican Party as a corporation goes bankrupt? It's no longer an entity. Now it can reform, mind you, but presumably it would then fall under those same rules of you need hundreds of thousands of signatures. Forget about getting on the stage, because now the Democrats control that access.
Yeah. So it depends on how it's written state by state. A lot of them, they just straight up say Republican or Democrat. It's actually very brazen. It's wild to watch in court. The courts will say, we saw this in New York when Larry Sharpe was running for governor in 22. The judge said in that court decision, he said, this is blatantly unconstitutional. It is against state law as well. And it has the effect of suppressing votes by suppressing voter choices. And I'm going to allow it. And that happens a lot when it comes to these cases where the courts are just like, this is terrible. It is illegal. So that's what we're going to do. Some states, the way they get around it is they'll say you have to get X% in order to be recognized. And so that's why if you're in Libertarian Party circles, we're always talking about 5%, because if we get 5% nationally, it pretty much ensures we get what's called major party status, and they can't do this stuff to us through the whole next 4-year election cycle. So the next midterms, the by-elections in the off year, and the next presidential race year, they can't do that to us for at least the next 4 years. It's why we try to push for that 5%. But my thing is, well, you know what's going to happen. If we get 5%, they're just going to raise it to 8%. We saw that with the debates. When Ross Perot got on the debate stage, it was because he was able to do so back when the League of Women Voters, I think it was called, who ran the debates at the time. Their requirement was you had to be on enough state ballots that you could conceivably win the Electoral College. So then he got on the debate stage. And probably if he had actually wanted to win it and not just torpedo things for Bush, he would have won that election. And so they said, yeah, we're never going to do that again. So the Republicans and Democrats created the Commission on Presidential Debates, the CPD, basically took over the debates and turned it into a cartel where now you have to get 15% or more on at least 3 reputable opinion polls. But they don't say the opinion polls have to actually mention you. And if we ever got 15%, they'd raise it to 20 the next time or 25 the next time. I kind of talked past a little bit your original question about Republicans being able to be on the ballot. It depends on state to state whether the original entity going bankrupt, if that would factor in or not. I suspect it wouldn't in most cases. But what we're starting to see is the Democrats have started saying, you know, we could kick the Republicans off the ballot too. Like, I mean, we've been doing this to third parties forever and the courts have been upholding it. And the Republicans are going to be hard pressed to fight against it in court because they're our partners in doing this. Yeah, let's do it to Trump too.
Wow.
I mean, my hope is, first of all, that they aren't successfully able to kick Trump off the ballot. I agree on Trump very little, but I believe that Americans should be able to choose who they want to pick for president across the board. They need more choices. The idea of the person who's leading in the polls not being on the ballot is an affront to the whole idea of a democratic republic. But also, I hope that if the case law is solid enough, that leads us to be able to challenge when they kick us off the ballot for no reason other than we're not a Republican or Democrat.
Now, smart listeners, Spike, and that's the only kind we have, are going to think to themselves right now, this Spike fella is talking out of both sides of his mouth, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I think they're going to be wrong. I don't think you are, and I want you to explain why you're not.
Sure.
But you said a moment ago that we've become quite coarse. I'm putting words in your mouth here. You didn't say coarse, but I mean, this is the gist of it. And that we use the political parties to take chunks out of each other every time we get the chance. And that is so obvious that it barely requires description. And yet, then you said that the two parties are in cahoots to such a degree that they're inseparable.
Oh, that's factually accurate, though. So
I know it's factually accurate, but how can these two things be true simultaneously?
yeah, so there's a difference between saying this person or this candidate or this idea is bad because it's Republican, and or saying we should support policies that hurt people who we disagree with or hate politically, and saying the establishments of the Republican and Democratic parties have for the past 100+ years, basically since the end of the Civil War, have worked hand in glove together to make sure that other parties have as difficult a time as humanly possible to get on the ballot. So when I say they're in cahoots, I mean, like, we could literally go through the history of the ballot access restrictions that have put in place, the fact that the FEC largely exists as an entity to make sure that only the Republicans and Democrats have the footing needed to be able to run effective statewide and federal campaigns. So that's what I mean by that. I'm not saying all Republicans and Democrats are bad or anything like that. I'm saying when it comes to this issue, there has been, in almost every state, the Republicans and Democrats work very closely together. Put it this way, in Ohio, it was the Republicans that were in charge, and they were trying to kick off the Libertarian and Green parties. We successfully fought to keep both of our parties on that ballot. In Illinois, it was the Democrats doing it. In New York, it was the Democrats doing it. In Tennessee, it was the Republicans doing it. Usually it's the majority that's taking the lead on it, but you don't see the minority party in that, whether it's the Democrat or the Republican. You rarely see any of them saying, hey, that's not right. In fact, very often in Tennessee, some of the most vociferous defenders of their ballot access restrictions were the Democrats, who were saying, well, we won't be the minor party anymore if there are other choices behind Republican. They're literally saying in the actual proceedings in public that the only reason we're even able to stay the second party is because people vote for us because we're not Republican. If you give all these other choices, we won't be the minor party anymore. And that's why we Democrats have to support this Republican effort to keep other parties off the ballot.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.